Your one click on the subscribe button makes a huge difference. Thank you for your kind support.
The case of Joanna Yeates, meticulously explored in the documentary. The murder of Joanna Yeates is a stark and haunting reminder of the tragic fallout that can ensue from both the horrors of violent crime and the compounding recklessness of a media frenzy. Set against the backdrop of Bristol, England, Yeates' murder in December 2010 captured the nation's attention, not only because of the senseless nature of the crime itself but also due to the subsequent cascade of missteps, misunderstandings, and injustices that unfolded over the weeks and months following her death. The documentary does an exceptional job of dissecting the various layers of the case, highlighting not only the personal and societal consequences but also the long-term implications for law enforcement, journalism, and public trust. On December 19, 2010, Joanna Yeates, affectionately known as Jo, was reported missing after spending an evening out with colleagues at a pub. A 25-year-old landscape architect with a promising career and a vibrant social life, Jo had recently moved into a flat in Bristol with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. The couple, by all appearances, were in a loving, stable relationship, and Jo's sudden disappearance raised alarm bells almost immediately. Notably, Greg had been away visiting family that weekend, and upon returning home on December 19th, he found their flat empty. Jo's phone and coat were still at the flat, suggesting she hadn't gone far. Over the next several days, the search for Jo intensified, with both her family and the police launching appeals to the public for information. The initial stages of the investigation were marked by an outpouring of public sympathy and support. Flyers were distributed, social media campaigns were started, and the local and national news covered the case extensively. However, the situation took a grim turn on Christmas Day when Joanna's body was discovered in Fale Ann, a rural area approximately 3 miles from her home, by a couple out walking their dog. Clad in jeans and a top but missing one sock and one shoe, Jo's body was found partially covered in snow. The post-mortem examination revealed that she had been strangled, and injuries on her body suggested that she'd likely engaged in a desperate struggle for her life before succumbing to asphyxiation. The discovery of her body confirmed the worst fears of those who had hoped for her safe return and marked the beginning of a harrowing murder investigation. Central to the investigation was Jo's landlord, Christopher Jeffries, whose name would later become both infamous and emblematic of the dangers of media scrutiny. A retired teacher with an eccentric demeanor and a mop of distinctive white hair, Jeffries was known to tenants and neighbors as a somewhat reclusive but harmless figure. However, in the days following the discovery of Jo's body, Jeffries found himself in the crosshairs of both the police and the press. He was arrested on December 30, 2010, reportedly on the basis of inconsistencies in his statements to investigators and the fact that his flat was in close proximity to Jo's. His arrest was front-page news, and vicious speculation about his character quickly followed. Tabloids depicted him as a deviant, painting a grotesque and unsubstantiated portrait that went far beyond his alleged connection to the crime. The media's vilification of Jeffries is one of the most striking elements of the documentary. Headlines screamed of his supposed odd behaviors. His private life was dragged into the spotlight, and his name became synonymous with guilt in the court of public opinion, long before any evidence could substantiate such claims. This frenzy not only destroyed Jeffries' reputation but also derailed the investigation, as police resources were redirected toward a suspect who ultimately proved to have no connection to Jo's murder whatsoever. The documentary provides harrowing details of Jeffries' experience during this time, showing how the intense pressure and relentless media coverage left him deeply traumatized. His eventual exoneration came too late to repair the tremendous damage done to his life. Meanwhile, the actual perpetrator was living in plain sight. Vincent Tabak, a Dutch engineer who lived in the same building as Jo and Greg, had initially seemed cooperative during the early stages of the investigation. Tabak had even joined in discussions about Joanna's disappearance with neighbors and expressed condolences when her body was found. However, his facade began to crack when new forensic evidence and surveillance footage came to light. DNA evidence from Jo's body ultimately matched Tabak, and cell phone records placed him near the location where her body was found. On January 20, 2011, Tabak was arrested and charged with Joe's murder. What came next was a shocking confession from Tabak, though his version of events stood in stark contrast to the evidence and painted him in an extremely manipulative light. Tabak admitted to inviting himself into Joe's flat on the evening of December 17, 2010, claiming that it had been an innocent visit that quickly escalated into tragedy after she allegedly rejected his advances. He described strangling her in a sudden fit of rage, then panicking and disposing of her body. However, the prosecution argued, and evidence strongly suggested, that Tabak's actions were premeditated. Text messages and emails recovered from his devices revealed a disturbing pattern of voyeurism and a fascination with violent pornography, including material that involved strangulation. His guilt was eventually proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. The documentary dedicates significant attention to the aftermath of Joe's murder, highlighting the resilience of her loved ones as they struggled to make sense of her loss. Greg Reardon, her boyfriend, and her parents, David and Teresa Yeates, became outspoken advocates for justice, determined not to let Joe be remembered solely as a victim but rather as a vibrant, talented young woman whose life was tragically stolen. They also raised awareness about the toll of media sensation and misinformation, as they watched firsthand how the press skewed the narrative surrounding Joe's death, particularly in the scapegoating of Christopher Jeffries. A key theme explored in the documentary is the dangerous power of assumptions, by the media, by investigators, and by the public, and how these assumptions can cloud judgment and derail justice. Christopher Jeffries' ordeal, in particular, serves as a sobering reminder that the rush to judgment can have devastating consequences. His story exposes the broader flaws in a media-driven justice system, where sensationalism often overtakes substance, and individuals become collateral damage in the pursuit of a headline. The ending of the documentary reflects on the broader social impacts of the case. While Joe's killer was ultimately brought to justice, the lingering questions about the role of the media, the ethics of law enforcement, and the fragility of public trust remain. The filmmakers emphasize that this case was not an isolated incident but rather a microcosm of systemic issues that continue to undermine the integrity of criminal investigations. As a result, viewers are left to grapple with uncomfortable but necessary questions. How can we prevent another innocent person from enduring what Christopher Jeffries endured? What safeguards can be put in place to balance the public's right to know with the presumption of innocence? From a cinematic perspective, the documentary employs a range of techniques to maintain a tone of solemnity and respect for Joanna's memory while also critiquing the societal forces that exacerbated the tragedy. The use of archival footage, including news broadcasts and interviews, juxtaposes the initial hopefulness of the search for Joe with the grim reality of the investigation's many missteps. Interviews with key figures, including Joe's family, legal experts, and even Jeffries himself, provide emotional depth and first-hand insight, creating a humanizing counterbalance to the often clinical depiction of criminal investigations. Symbolism also plays a subtle but significant role in the film. For instance, the motif of snow, which covered Joe's body when it was found, recurs throughout the documentary as a visual metaphor for both purity and concealment. The snow represents the innocence of Joanna's life, cut short by a senseless act of violence, but it also underscores the way in which the truth was obscured, not only by the literal burial of her body but also by the figurative burial of facts under layers of distortion and speculation. This recurring imagery serves to reinforce the dual narrative of tragedy and distortion that defines the case. In terms of fan theories or alternate interpretations, some viewers have speculated about whether Tabak may have had other victims, given the deeply disturbing nature of his online activity and his apparent skill in evading suspicion during the early stages of the investigation. However, no evidence has emerged to support these theories, and they remain purely speculative. Others have questioned the extent to which systemic issues in law enforcement contributed to Tabak's ability to commit the crime, suggesting that earlier scrutiny of his background might have prevented Joanna's murder altogether. In conclusion, the murder of Joanna Yeates is a deeply affecting documentary that serves not only as a recounting of a horrific crime but also as a cautionary tale about the perils of assumptions, the responsibilities of the media, and the need for a more thoughtful and ethical approach to justice. The case leaves a legacy that is both tragic and instructive, reminding us of the human cost of sensationalism and the urgent need for reform in how we respond to tragedy.